The Bank of Canada just made its first interest rate decision since a trade war with the US became a real possibility. They cut their overnight interest rate a 1/4 percentage point, which is great news for anyone borrowing money. But they also acknowledged that a storm may be coming.
We will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
Trump's promised tariffs have the potential to throw Canada's economy into a tailspin.
Tariff!
In the case of a protracted, significant trade conflict, it would badly hurt economic activity in Canada.
There is still a ton of uncertainty here about how all of this will play out, but the Bank of Canada did lay out a worst-case scenario and what it might mean. Let's go through it. So what is the most severe scenario? Well, it's where Donald Trump goes full steam ahead and implements 25% tariffs across the board, as he said he'll do, and where Canada implements sweeping retaliatory tariffs in response, as they've suggested they might do. The first thing the Bank of Canada predicts is that this would cause a significant decline in the volume of exports from Canada to the US, which makes sense because tariffs are just taxes paid for by the businesses doing the buying. So if American companies suddenly have to pay more for the same Canadian stuff because there's a 25% tax on everything Canadian, they might just decide to buy less stuff to avoid the tariffs altogether.
What tariffs should do is decrease anybody's willingness to buy the more expensive product and make them come up with ways of finding something cheaper, something more efficient, something closer to home.
And if demand starts decreasing for Canadian exports, the value of those exports could drop too.
Usually when there's less demand for a product, the price of that product falls as well. And the Bank of Canada is saying that would happen here.
Whether you're exporting to the US or not is almost irrelevant. It's just merely the fact that you are producing more than what your domestic economy needs.
So you take those things together, lower demand for Canadian goods and lower prices for those goods. That's bad news for Canadian business. And you know what Canada exports an awful lot of? Oil.
If you take $10 off the price of oil, that's a couple $2 billion less of royalty revenue that the province is bringing in.
And here you start to see how every downside outcome causes another downside outcome, like dominoes falling one by one. Because the Bank of Canada writes that eventually that kind of hit to business would cause Canadian exporters to lower production and lay off workers. They've got to scale down if they're not making the same kind of money, right? There's no exact figure for how many jobs they think could be lost, but
we would probably expect the unemployment rate rises about a percentage point or so.
You're easily talking into the hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Doug Ford says as many as 500,000 jobs in Ontario alone. Just about everybody involved in this has a slightly different figure, but the short answer is an enormous number of Canadian jobs are exposed to this, are at risk as a result of it.
And it's not just job losses, because when you think about how Canada might retaliate, putting countervailing tariffs, taxes on American imports to Canada, I mean, just think of what American products you rely on any given day.
Things like fresh fruit and vegetables, which obviously it's winter in Canada. We import a lot of those from the United States.
There's also cars, machinery, drugs, chemicals, electronics. Those might all become more expensive too. For the same reason that US tariffs make things more expensive in the US. Canadian companies importing American things will have to pay Canadian tariffs to the Canadian government. And in many cases, some or all of those additional costs may eventually be passed on to Canadian consumers.
The reality is that the more of their stuff that we tariff, whether as part of the supply chain or whether as part of just being consumers that we consume the products directly, we're going to start paying more money.
So, lost jobs, less purchasing power, which brings us to the Bank of Canada's next prediction. According to the Bank of Canada, all of these factors together could cause Canada's GDP to fall pretty significantly. They do acknowledge in their analysis that the government could mitigate this by taking some of that tariff money that they start charging and pumping it back into the economy, either to businesses or consumers themselves. But even still,
this would have a very material effect, would have a very severe effect on economic activity.
So how severe are we talking? Well, here's where we begin to understand how impossibly complex this question becomes. Because instead of giving just one definitive prediction in this case, the bank maps out multiple ways in which this one scenario could play out, depending on how quickly businesses pass on their extra costs to us, the consumers, and how everybody responds to this general idea of certain things becoming more expensive. But best case, they predict next year, Canada's GDP would be 2.2% lower than what it would have been otherwise. Worst case, 3% lower. To which maybe you're like, 3%, that's not so bad. Except it's bad enough to throw the country into a recession.
The economy is growing about 1.8% right now. In their assumption, if we get a 2.5 percentage point hit to growth, that's pretty consistent with normal recession in Canada.
I think the interesting thing here is it's effectively a permanent recession. There's no real way out of that drop in GDP. And I think that's where it starts to get really hard to really measure and get your head around what that actually feels like, what it looks like.
So here's one more question. If this worst case scenario does play out and this brand of tariff war forces Canada into a recession with no clear endpoint, how exactly might the bank respond? We're talking about interest rates, right? That's the lever the Bank of Canada has. But on this, the one real thing we turned to them for guidance on, they were actually pretty cryptic, opting not to give any real indication as to what it might do next.
There's a lot of uncertainty out there, and it just didn't seem very useful to provide guidance. And even when we do know more, we're going to have to do some more work to figure out exactly how that's going to play out through the economy.
But we've asked the question. We've all been through recessions before, so let's try to answer this question anyway.
Typically, the response you would see to that would be the Bank of Canada cutting interest rates when the economy weakens.
Right, because if you lower rates, you make it cheaper for Canadians to borrow money, which makes it more likely that they'll spend money, and that can help stimulate a struggling economy. But it's not so simple, because we're not just talking about a lagging economy. We're talking about higher prices at the same time.
Growth will be weaker, inflation will be higher.
Because that's the direct impact of tariffs. When things like fruits and vegetables get more expensive, that's inflation. The Bank of Canada's #1 priority is inflation and keeping it in check. And it is predicting in this severe scenario, yes, inflation goes up. By how much? Again, depends on too many things to calculate ahead of time. And what happened most recently when inflation was a really big problem in this country? What did the Bank of Canada do? It raised interest rates aggressively to cool the economy and try to get prices under control. And it worked. So there's reason to think maybe they'll be forced to do that again, and we'll end up in a rate hiking cycle, which lands us now with the opposite solution that we had just outlined of cutting rates to give a lagging economy a kickstart.
So which one do? You can't step on the brake and the gas at the same time.
It becomes a really, volatile, interesting, and confusing mesh of countervailing forces all at play at once.
Now, we could get into the specific reasons why one solution might be better than the other, and why there's reason to think that a rate hike is actually the least likely scenario.
So in a normal cycle, you would have a really strong economy, and that's driving inflation because there's so much demand out there. The difference in this environment is that inflation is being kind of imposed by these tariffs and pushed through to producers and consumers at a time when growth is actually weakening.
But really, you can start to see why the Bank of Canada's governor today kind of just threw up his hands.
Monetary policy cannot offset the economic consequences of a protracted trade conflict. We can't lean against weaker growth and higher inflation at the same time. So, what are we going to be doing? Well, we're going to be assessing the relative weight of those two.
The bottom line being, this would be a pretty unprecedented spot for Canadians and the Bank of Canada to be in. And though the bank can do all it can to try to understand what Canadians can expect next, they've also made clear it's pretty much impossible to know for sure.